We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked.
And complete the dang fence.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill.
Cast down your bucket where you are.
We come from France.
And I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants.
They're coming in by the thousands, just unbelievable.
A wall is an immorality.
Who are you rooting for?
Those masters of the universe are at it again.
They're not sending their best.
You maniac! You blew it up!
Welcome to Parsing Immigration Policy, the podcast of the Center for Immigration Studies. My name is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center. And we hear a lot of talk about vetting visa applicants, vetting citizenship applicants, that sort of thing. And it's obviously an essential function in immigration, screening out people that we don't want to be living here. In fact, we have a whole database, National Security Vetting Failures, a database on our website, which has dozens of cases of people who had some kind of national security issue, terrorists, spies, war criminals, what have you, that somehow got through the vetting. But that's a pretty low bar. In other words, we're talking about people we're admitting to live among us and maybe even become citizens of our country. And the, vetting should be more. In fact, the law requires that the vetting be more than just show us that you're not a rapist or a war criminal. Obviously, we don't want that, but there needs to be a higher bar. The law requires a higher bar. In fact, the law requires that people for certain benefits, naturalization especially, demonstrate what the law specifically calls good moral character. And I don't know about you, but I know a lot of people who were neither rapists nor war criminals, but I would not qualify them as having good moral character. And so, since immigration is something optional that we decide whether you're going to be able to move here or continue living here or become a citizen, we're going to apply, we should apply, and the law requires that we apply a higher standard. Unfortunately, that hasn't been the case for a long time. Good moral character basically really was, okay, there's no active warrant for your arrest. Well, I guess you have good moral character. Well, this administration, as in so many other areas, is actually taking the law, the Immigration and Nationality Act, seriously and trying to implement its requirements. And recently, USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is the division within Homeland Security that does a lot of these issues like green cards and citizenship, issued some new policy directives, and they are directed toward actually trying to do a better job of picking people more effectively that we want to be living here among us and potentially becoming U.S. citizens, rather than just this kind of lowest common denominator of not being a Hamasnik or something. So to talk about these new policy directives, and there's several of them, we have our own Elizabeth Jacobs in the studio, our Director of Regulatory Affairs and Policy. So Liz, if you could first just give the kind of general overview of what it is that USCIS is trying to do here.
So basically, USCIS is today taking the tools that Congress gave the agency years ago and telling officers how they can apply these tools, and in some cases, broadening their discretion. For example, you brought up the good moral character example. That policy is based on Section 316A of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which prohibits immigration officers from granting a naturalization application if they find that the applicant does not show good moral character. Previously, they used to look at a checklist to see if they had committed certain actions or crimes that the law makes a mandatory bar to naturalization. And if they hadn't taken any of those actions, they would move on with their analysis.
So in other words, they would assume that they had good moral character.
Correct.
If you hadn't done one of these aggravated felonies or something like that.
Correct. Now USCIS is requiring its officers to take what we call a totality of the circumstances analysis, or a more holistic approach, not only to look to see if one of those mandatory bars, like if the applicant had committed murder exists, but also to look for signs of positive signs of good moral character. Like, do they contribute to their community in any substantial way? Also, they are instructed to look for more signs of rehabilitation for previous bad acts. So, for example, if an alien had not been paying their taxes, have they set up a payment plan to repay owed taxes?
Interesting. So, in other words, even if there was no criminal issue there, they're looking at, like you said, something more than that. You know what this reminds me of is, and you would know this since you've gone through this as an attorney, it's sort of like admission to the bar.
Correct.
I mean, it's not the same thing, but it is sort of, you have to demonstrate more than you're just not a forger or a war criminal in order to be admitted to the bar.
Exactly. So it's not just a list of criminal activities that could bar you for a good moral character assessment, but there are some technically lawful activities that would still be considered if they're what USCIS says is inconsistent with civic responsibility. And these things are reoccurring traffic violations, harassment, aggressive solicitation. Those would be weighed negatively too.
Interesting.
False claims to citizenship, multiple
that's a
DUI.
crime, though, too. I mean, anyway, right?
Correct. But
Right.
that would be something that perhaps could be overcome through evidence submitted by the applicant showing that they either took steps to rehabilitate from that or they had overwhelmingly persuasive reason to have done that.
Right.
It's now become more of a nuanced assessment that immigration officers are empowered to look at a variety of factors rather than, okay, you didn't commit murder or there's no evidence in the file that you're a habitual drunkard. That's a specific bar that's listed in the INA. Or another specific bar in the INA is polygamy,
Right.
prostitution, those things. Like I said, historically, they would just look to see if there's evidence of any of that activity and move on. Now they're actually going to analyze whether there's evidence of good moral character, not just not good moral character.
Yeah, interesting. And just, I should have mentioned this at the beginning. When you're listening to this, we probably will already have done, I will have done an interview, a video interview at the National Press Club with Joseph Edlow, who's the director of USCIS. And I'll be asking some of these kinds of things, but what I wanted to do here is talk about it in a little more detail because USCIS has a very broad array of responsibilities, and I'm not going to spend half an hour, 45 minutes with Director Edlow talking about just this, but this is something that requires some more detail. So that's why, Liz, I wanted you to talk about it.
In the USCIS context, good moral character assessments are generally reserved for naturalization, but USCIS under Edlow's leadership has also issued policies broadening officers' exercise of discretion for other immigration benefits too, and that's something I think we need to talk about.
But along the same lines, in other words, it's not under the rubric of, quote, good moral character, unquote, but it's still basically a kind of higher level vetting. Would that be a fair way to put it?
Exactly. So generally speaking, not all immigration benefits are what I call mandatory immigration benefits. And a mandatory immigration benefit would be one where if an applicant is able to establish they meet the eligibility criteria, USCIS must approve it. Many immigration benefits are what we call discretionary. So the law says that the secretary may grant XYZ. One example is asylum. There are plenty other examples. So essentially, in a discretionary immigration benefit, even if the applicant establishes they meet the eligibility criteria, the immigration officer can still, as a matter of discretion, deny the approval of that benefit.
So it's not just a matter of ticking off the boxes. I mean, there are other things where if you tick off the boxes, then they really do have to give you whatever the benefit is.
Exactly. And colloquially, we used to say, when explaining how discretion should be used for discretionary benefits, is, would you want this person to be your neighbor? Like,
in fact, in a sense, that's what all of this vetting stuff is about. In other words, even the criminal vetting, even the everything vetting is, do you want this person to be your neighbor? And so yeah, that's it. So what are some of the benefits where USCIS has discretion to not grant it to you if they think that you would not be a good neighbor?
Asylum is a great example of that, where withholding of removal, which provides similar sorts of protection, is mandatory. Asylum is not, and asylum provides more benefits than benefit like withholding or removal.
I see.
Another example are national interest waivers for people arriving on EB-2 visas, employment-based 2 visas.
Right.
And the national interest waiver will allow them to circumvent some labor tests, labor market tests in order to enter the United States. But that requires that immigration officers consider whether it is in the national interest of that person be admitted. And that is a purely discretional matter as well.
Interesting. And so if that were applied here, the question is, what is defining the national interest in a kind of subjective way. So what are some of the things in this discretion policy update?
So the most notable changes to USCIS's policy manual update is that USCIS now is being explicit that if someone has engaged in anti-American, anti-Semitic, or terrorism-related activities, then that should be overwhelmingly weighed negatively when exercising discretion. It isn't an automatic bar, but it is telling officers to look for these types of activities and again, I quote, weigh them overwhelmingly negative in their assessment.
So if they were actual terrorists, that's already...
Yes, that's already
off the table. But,
that's already a ground of inadmissibility.
Right. But here you're talking about supporting terrorism, supporting enemies of America, supporting Jew hatred, that sort of thing. In other words, even if you haven't actually raped any babies, if you are a big Hamas fan or want to overthrow the government of the United States, even if you haven't done anything, you can be turned down.
Yes, the guidance specifically points to Section 313A of the Immigration and Nationality Act, and that one is a bar to naturalization, but it bars individuals who, if they support the overthrow of the United States government, organized governments more generally, if they are members of the Communist Party, or they favor totalitarian forms of government, they are barred from naturalization. And the agency is now using that section as its framework to determine what they consider to be anti-American. Okay. Can they go further? I think with the guidance, how it's written, they could consider other activities as anti-American, but that is how it's defined.
And so they're basically using this list of activities or even sort of sentiments in the law related to naturalization, but they're applying it more broadly, is what you're saying.
That's right, to any immigration benefit that is discretionary in nature.
Interesting.
So discretionary denials, like I said, is not a new concept. It is something that USCIS does with every adjudication for these benefits. But what USCIS has done is explicitly told officers that they have to look and consider these things. And they've also have allowed officers to use social media more to investigate these types of things. It will increase perhaps the amount of work that each individual immigration officer must do to adjudicate a file. But in my view, these are things they should have been doing already. We do not want to be admitting people who support the overthrow of the United States government. Obviously, and they've taken action, especially if they've taken actions to further that end.
And so this would be things like checking out their Facebook profile and their Twitter feed and that sort of thing, right?
That's right.
Right. Interesting. You kind of wonder why this wasn't done all along, quite frankly. And one thing that comes to mind, and if I'd actually kind of like to know what the story here is, because I remember reading after the Cold War ended, Barney Frank, then a congressman, got actually the Congress to pass legislation saying basically that you couldn't turn people down who were foreigners for activities. It was activities, associations, something like that, that would be legal if U.S. citizens did them, kind of applying the First Amendment to every foreigner living abroad. How does that intersect with these new policy guidances?
Well, the First Amendment does not apply, or those protections do not apply to aliens who are living outside the United States, and is kind of a separate issue to whether or not they warrant a favorable grant of discretion from an immigration officer.
Right.
The U.S. Constitution gives Congress plenary authority over immigration to decide who can enter, stay, and remain, and under what terms, and they have delegated discretion to officers in order to ensure that the people that are admitted promote the good order and happiness of the United States. Right. I think that we can all agree that individuals who want to overthrow our government. I mean, it's a pretty extreme case, but it's something that we should be looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's going to be a lot more of, people who favor totalitarian forms of government, that kind of thing. People who promote anti-Semitism, again, which if you're an American, you get to do that, as loathsome as it might be, but we don't have to let you in if you're that kind of lowlife.
Considering the numbers of people that we naturalize and people that we admit to the United States really puts kind of a better perspective on this. Like, for example, USCIS received 993,000 naturalization applications last year and approved over 816,000 of them, so about 89%. There's a lot of opportunity for USCIS to go wrong there. So it's important for national security issues to allow officers to make discretionary denials when their gut tells them that this person is going to disrupt the order and happiness of our country.
Right, of course. And actually, this is a little off topic, but not exactly. We don't have to go into detail here. But Director Edlow has talked about raising the standards for naturalization test as well. Has there been any actual policy released on that, or is it so far, they were talking about that they're looking into it?
I haven't seen any updates. I know the first Trump administration attempted to increase the naturalization test with the language section and increasing the number of questions, I believe, that could be asked. And the Biden administration reverted to the original form. I think it was issued in 2008, the test that's being used today.
Right.
And that was partially because of litigation, but also because of their policy objectives.
Right.
But we are waiting to see what USCIS proposes going forward. I think that would have to be proposed before it can go into effect.
I see. In other words, the regulation that they'd have to have notice and comment on all the rest of that?
Perhaps.
Yeah, right. Anyway, but the point is, again, it's a similar thing. It's sort of trying to do a better job of picking and choosing among all of those people who want to, in this case, become citizens.
Critics of this policy are going to assert that this administration is trying to slow the gears of USCIS, where in reality, USCIS receives millions of immigration benefit requests annually, and the agency has plenty of people to pick from. So
it's kind of trying to basically raise the quality of the people that get whatever these benefits are.
And identify any bad apples if there are any.
Right.
And to do this, they introduced a third policy, and this one also is not technically a new policy, but they are going to resume doing what we call neighborhood investigations or personal investigations is what the law says. And that is authorized by the Immigration Nationality Act, Section 335A. And essentially what USCIS will be doing now is in cases where they feel like they don't have enough evidence to support an applicant's claim, or they feel that there are sufficient reasons to want to investigate further, they may send a USCIS officer to their neighborhood to talk to their neighbors, talk to their employers to corroborate the claims that the applicant has made. And that is an additional security feature.
Right. Yeah, because without doing that, basically it's all just a paper pushing process is kind of what it amounts to, right? I mean, here's my forms, check off your boxes and give me my benefit.
Exactly. And often the paper evidence isn't adequate to tell the whole story.
Or it may not even be real, quite frankly. I mean, who knows? But it kind of reminds me of the SAW amnesty, the Special Agricultural Workers Amnesty in the 1986 law, where back then the INS was under such pressure to move along the amnesty applications that the fraud was massive. They weren't able to do any of these kind of checks on the claims that people were making. And so people were getting green cards who, said they were agricultural workers. And, some of them were asked, okay, well, what kind of agricultural work did you do? Well, I picked watermelons. And they said, well, did you go up on the ladder and pick the watermelons off the watermelon tree? They were like, oh, yeah, a lot of watermelons off the watermelon tree. Or they were digging cherries out of the ground, or they were picking purple cotton. All of these kind of things that, first of all, and now they're punchlines almost, but that kind of massive fraud is the sort of thing that if you're able to take time like this and go and talk to an employer is a whole lot harder to get away with. So my only point here is that these neighborhood investigations that USCIS has now said they're going to potentially start doing again isn't just necessarily to raise the bar of vetting to make sure you get a better quality of applicant, but to actually root out fraud as well, right?
Exactly. A classic example of a neighborhood investigation might be USCIS stopping by someone's home to see if they're actually live there, right? Or if they're requesting a benefit based on marriage to see if there's any evidence that the spouse
they actually live together.
Or I think the important thing to emphasize here is that the agency has not said that they're going to do this for every application, but the law gives them the authority to waive this investigation on a case-by-case basis. And it seems like USCIS is really going to focus their resources for cases where the applicant didn't provide sufficient evidence to support their claims and where their fraud is suspected.
And so the issue here with these neighborhood investigations is not that everybody's going to have somebody come out and talk to their employer or visit their house, but that the current policy or the previous policy just waived these kind of investigations altogether. In other words, nobody got them, regardless.
Yeah, it's been about a little over 30 years since USCIS not USCIS, it was INS at the time, has done this.
Right.
But this is, like I said, not a new law by any means, and it's something that this administration is choosing to employ in order to further their vetting.
Right. Interesting. Altogether, how would you describe what this suggests about USCIS's, approach to assessing applicants, to deciding who gets to get these benefits?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that the Trump administration is now considering USCIS to take an important role in the national security and vetting of aliens who enter the United States. It's not just a CBP or an ICE activity, and that they're using the tools that Congress gave them in order to ensure that no true threats exist with the immigration system. It's a different approach than the Biden administration took. I think the Biden administration, yes, but the phrasing they may have used to describe USCIS's mission is as a welcoming agency. Mm-hmm. And I think under this administration, they are considering themselves to be a vetting agency. And essentially, that is what an immigration agency does, because if there is no vetting without adjudicating a application properly, it's just an open border system. To have a true immigration policy, you actually have to make sure that the right people are excluded, the right people are let in, and that the people who are let in comply with the conditions of their visa terms or whatever that is.
In a sense, it's sort of a basic difference in perspective that we're seeing now, because under Biden, and frankly, even earlier, the perspective, my sense was that every applicant should be approved unless there's some real reason they shouldn't be. In other words, in a sense, it was almost on the government to show, and I don't mean legally speaking, but basically the approach was, it was a government's responsibility to show why you shouldn't be let in. Whereas what you're seeing now is kind of the opposite. It's your responsibility as an applicant to show why you should be let in. You see what I mean? In other words, it's not strictly in a legal sense a burden of proof issue, but colloquially speaking, it's kind of the burden of proof was on the government to explain why you shouldn't get this benefit. Whatever the benefit is a whole bunch of them. But now, in a sense, what they're saying, and again, colloquially speaking, the burden of proof is on you to show why you are going to actually provide value to the United States and, show that you have good moral character. And the other thing is attachment to the U.S. Constitution, which is something that, we've let a lot of people in who don't have that kind of attachment. In other words, my point here is burden of proof is on the alien applicant to show why it is we should let them get this benefit.
The way I view it is that USCIS immigration officers now will be looking at broader categories, activities, and evidence before granting an immigration benefit. And they will also be looking for signs of fraud more vigorously than they had in the past.
Right.
Applicants will need to be a little bit more proactive when they apply by submitting evidence showing that, for example, if they're a naturalization applicant, that they have good moral character. They could do that with letters from their employer or whatever community. But they should also be on notice now that the government will be looking to see what is publicly available on their social media accounts. Are there reasons that the government should be concerned?
Right. Now, the last thing, we're running out of time. Last thing I wanted to ask is, and this isn't strictly this is kind of about these new directives, is that USCIS adjudicators, and I don't mean this in any way to impugn anybody, but on average, they've come up through a culture of service providing. In other words, that's the way often USCIS has been distinguished from ICE and CBP, that it's the service providing agency, that their job, that their customers are the alien applicants. And that's clearly not the administration's approach. It's clearly not Director Edlow's approach. He's been quite open about that. But there is still kind of this almost corporate culture of customer service. And so it seems to me that this kind of thing is going to face some challenges in that it's going to have to almost like re-educate at least some portion of USCIS adjudicators about what their actual job is.
Yeah, USCIS will always have the challenge of balancing vetting and thorough investigation with administrative efficiency. They, like I said, receive millions of petitions and applications per year that they have to adjudicate. It looks poorly on the agency when applicants are waiting multiple years for a decision. So that's something that perhaps in the past had motivated USCIS leadership and immigration officers to do more cursory reviews of applicants' backgrounds. But I think, like we keep saying, is this administration is changing that focus. And to the extent that it impacts processing times, we will see. But that it's always a challenge that USCIS has to deal with.
Right. It's sort of the tension between basically speed versus quality.
Exactly.
And
cost.
Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But the emphasis has been historically on speed. And so now essentially this administration is trying to sort of rebalance it to make quality more important, or the quality of the decisions more important than they were in the past.
That's right. I think this administration is viewing USCIS as an agency that serves the American people unless it serves applicants from abroad.
Right. Exactly. Okay. Well, good. Thank you, Liz. I think this was a good deep dive into USCIS's kind of almost really change of culture. I mean, these are all different aspects of it, but this is all part of the broader movement or change of USCIS to be, as you said, directed more toward its customers being the American people rather than its customers being immigrants. And thank you, Liz, and we'll have you back when there are more regulations that are issued and policy directives, as inevitably there will be.
Thank you so much.
And just as a last reminder, if you're listening to this before 9:30 in the morning on Thursday, September 4th, you can watch our newsmaker interview with Director Edlow, Joe Edlow, who runs USCIS and deals with these issues that we talked about. And, if it's not, the full interview will be on our website at cis.org. And I think it's going to be an interesting event, and I hope to learn something about what this administration's planning for the future, in addition to the things they've already announced. So with that, thank you for tuning in to this episode of Parsing Immigration Policy. Thank you to Brian Griffith, our indefatigable producer, for making this work. And if you have any comments, questions, complaints, what have you, please email us at center@cis.org. Hope you tune in next week.